Chapter 1. The first time Sarah heard the stories about the haunted gold mine, it sounded like an adventure waiting to happen. She figured if it was big enough for ghosts, it'd be big enough for her. Besides, the entrance was only a mile up from their campsite. With that thought in mind, she decided to take the 3-mile hike to the mine for a closer look, just to see if the stories held any truth. Dark clouds rolled overhead as Sarah closed the hood of her pickup truck. She glanced at the sky and took a deep breath. Even with the threat of rain, there was no way she could turn back now. She swung her backpack over one shoulder and reached into the bed of the truck to grab a flashlight, a canteen of water, and her camera. Sarah always liked to document her travels, and adding a hint of danger to the stories would just make them more interesting. As she approached the entrance of the abandoned gold mine, she noticed the jagged metal bars that once kept people out now stood like skeletal frames around the gaping hole. Weeds had taken over, their green tendrils reaching out to the darkness below. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the distant whispers of wind through the trees and the faint patter of raindrops on the ground. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She was not afraid of the mine, but uncertain of what she would find. She shivered as the cool air washed over her, a chill that seemed to seep into every inch of her skin. "Sarah? Is that you?" A voice called out, causing her to jump. It was her best friend, Max, who had offered to stay behind at the campsite. He was tall, athletic, and had a goofy grin on his face. "You're not seriously going in there, right?" She looked back at Max, trying to keep her cool. "Of course I am. What's the point of camping if we don't explore the nearby attractions?" He shook his head, a look of concern etched on his face. "It's not a joke, Sarah. People have gone in there and never come out. Besides, the entrance has been blocked off for years. There's no way to get inside." Sarah chuckled, unzipping her backpack to pull out a pair of wire cutters. "Well, that's what they want you to think." Max's eyes widened as Sarah slipped her fingers through the rusty metal bars and sliced through the tattered red ribbon that was meant to keep people away. "Sarah," Max cautioned, "it's not worth it. We can find something else to explore." Ignoring his warning, she shrugged the backpack onto her shoulders once more, grabbing hold of a metal beam above the entrance. Sarah hauled herself up with ease and then disappeared into the darkness with a faint clatter of her boots against the rocky floor. Max hesitated for a moment, then sighed. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans and then slowly followed Sarah into the entrance of the abandoned gold mine. The darkness inside was almost tangible. Chapter 2? A dim glow flickered in the distance as Sarah tread cautiously through the abandoned gold mine. Her footsteps echoed eerily, bouncing off the jagged rock walls, adding an ominous undertone to her surroundings. The air was oppressive, the musty scent of decay lingering upon her nose. Thoughts of the ghostly miner lurked in the back of her mind, taunting her. Suddenly, her flashlight illuminated a figure standing eerily still in the darkness. The ghostly miner! Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she froze, shining the flashlight directly onto the apparition. He wore a dusty old hat, and his eyes seemed to burn with an intense blue light. As she peered closer, the miner raised his hand, his mouth moving, but no sound came out. "What do you want?" she called, trying to hold her ground. The miner's ghost did not move. Instead, it pointed one gnarled, coal-stained finger toward the dark chamber ahead. Though the figure itself was silent, Sarah could almost hear its unspoken words. "Go back." "Are you warning me?" she asked, half joking, trying to alleviate the tension building in her chest. "Too late, I'm already inside." The eerie feeling inside Sarah grew stronger. The ghostly miner waved his arms, attempting to shoo her away from the ominous path ahead. Then, with surprising speed, he vanished, leaving Sarah to ponder what his appearance truly meant. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself it was just her imagination playing tricks. Shrugging off the strange encounter, Sarah pressed onwards, moving deeper into the gloom. Her flashlight flickered on the walls of the mine, revealing ancient graffiti etched into the stone. The brooding silence was occasionally broken by dripping water or the eerie creaking of unseen machinery. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet gave way, and she stumbled into a dark pit. She grabbed hold of a jagged rock, narrowly avoiding a dirt-covered fall. A nearby stream of water gushed, the sound echoing against the damp walls. "Sarah, calm down," she whispered to herself, trying to control her breathing. She hung there in the stale darkness, gathering her courage before continuing on. Sarah shone the flashlight around the perimeter of the pit, looking for any kind of foothold. Her heart raced as she scanned the slippery walls. "This is not what I expected," she murmured nervously under her breath, before spotting a worn wooden beam protruding from the wall. Grabbing hold of it, she took a few deep breaths, focusing her energy as she inched her foot upwards, searching for a secure foothold. Balancing precariously, Sarah began climbing up the wet, moss-covered beam. She strained every muscle and pushing herself higher. Her arms and legs trembled as she moved, but she wouldn't let her weary body betray her now. Chapter 3. Minutes turned into hours as Sarah plodded through the labyrinthine tunnels of the mine. The echoes of her footsteps reverberated off the damp, decades-old walls. An unsettling chill settled over her, thick like a creeping fog that threatened to smother her light spirit. The air was thick with the stench of decay and mold, her lungs yearning for fresh air. Ahead, shadows danced in the flickering light from her flashlight, beckoning her forward. Curious, Sarah ventured into the pitch-black chamber, her senses on high alert. As she stepped over uneven ground, shards of rock crunched underfoot. The echo of her footsteps lingered, amplifying the isolation she felt. Out of nowhere, an ethereal voice echoed through the mine, a low rumble that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "Leave!" The voice boomed, causing her to jump. She shone her flashlight around the room, searching for the source, but finding nothing. The echoing voice had rattled her nerves, but she took a deep breath and pressed forward. "Who's there?" she called, hoping for an answer, but all that met her ears was the deafening silence. It wasn't long before Sarah stumbled upon another chamber filled with mine carts, all rusted and worn down with age. They creaked in unison as they rolled slowly, almost imperceptibly along on the aged tracks. The ghostly figure reappeared, the old miner from before. It beckoned to Sarah, pointing to a narrow corridor. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the old miner. A flicker of doubt crossed her mind, wondering whether she'd made a mistake venturing so deep. Then again, she never backed down from a challenge. With one last glance, Sarah stepped into the corridor and began her descent further into the forgotten bowels of the mine. She shivered as a cold wind blew past, carrying whispers of days long past. The dank atmosphere was heavy with the weight of history, and she felt as though the very walls were telling their stories. Sarah noticed a faint glow emanating from farther into the corridor. The mineral veins in the rock, perhaps. A natural phenomenon that could explain the ghostly tales? She proceeded with caution, uneasiness tugging at her as she moved through the darkness. Before long, however, a sudden loud creaking sound made Sarah freeze in her tracks. The entire room started to shudder, and grit and dirt rained down upon her. Chapter 4. Sarah shivered in the dim light of her flashlight, her breath forming puffs of white in the chilled air. She'd stumbled upon a hidden chamber, and what she'd found within had sent a jolt of electricity through her veins. The miner's tools, rows upon rows of them, each bearing testament to the arduous labor and hardships that had once consumed the lives of the miners who worked here. The pickaxes, shovels, chisels, and drills lay dormant, huddled together like soldiers awaiting their next command. A peculiar sensation washed over Sarah as she stood amidst the horde of forgotten tools. It was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing fragments of the mine's sordid history that had, until now, remained concealed. "These tools aren't gonna dig you out," she whispered to herself. She picked up the nearest pickaxe, its handle covered in layers of dust and grime. Closing her eyes, she imagined she could hear the echoes of past miners swinging them around angrily, as if rebelling against the earth that held them captive. Reopening her eyes, she scrutinized the pickaxe, and a surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. This pickaxe was her only chance to escape the suffocating darkness enveloping the abandoned mine. There was no way of knowing how long it would take to hack through the thick stone wall, but she knew she had to try. Sarah wedged the pickaxe into the earthen vein before her, and with a grunt she swung the cold metal firmly against the wall. A flurry of stones ricocheted off the floor and walls, and she threw up her arms to shield her face. "This is insane," Max shouted, as his silhouette appeared in the doorway. He gasped upon seeing Sarah tightly gripping the pickaxe, his face etched with worry. "Sarah, you can't do this alone. That pickaxe isn't big enough to break through these walls." Sarah spared him a cautious glance, bracing herself against the soft thrumming of the tools grouped around her. She huffed, releasing the pressure she'd unconsciously applied to the pickaxe grip. "You're right. I can't do this alone," she acknowledged slowly, her eyes never leaving the looming exit column. She squared her jaw. But you can help." Max hesitated, wringing his hands. "I'm not sure. This is a bad idea, Sarah. This place gives me the creeps." She snorted. "Join the club." "Seriously," he said gently. "Let's get back to the campsite and tell everybody about these hidden chambers. Exploring is one thing, but actively destroying a historical monument goes too far." Sarah blinked, taking in his words. Chapter 5. Sarah's gaze shifted nervously between the towering walls of the mine and her reluctant companion, Max. His athletic build cast eerie shadows on the rocky floor as he leaned against a decaying timber support beam, casting side glances at her every move. The silence within the abandoned mine weighed heavy on Sarah's chest, leaving an ever-present taste of dust settled on the tip of her tongue. "Listen," Max broke the stillness between them as he jutted his chin towards the pickaxe clutched tightly in her hands. "I understand that you think that's the only way out, but there's gotta be another way. We can't just start hacking away at the walls of an abandoned gold mine, Sarah." Frustration bubbled up within her, and she spun around to face Max, her eyes burning with impatience. "Then what do you suggest we do, Max? Sit here and pray for rescue? Pray that the ghosts of these dead miners will suddenly take pity on us and point us towards an exit we somehow overlooked?" "I'd rather take action," she snapped. "Flex," Max raised both hands, palms out. All right. But let's not let emotions cloud our judgment, Sarah. There has to be a better way out of here." He crossed his arms and glared back at her, a newfound determination in his expression. Sarah eyed him skeptically. "You expect me to believe that you suddenly came up with a brilliant plan for us to escape this God-forsaken place?" "Not offhand," Max admitted with a half grin. "But I think we can make use of this mine's original infrastructure. The card tracks, for instance." Her skepticism gave way to curiosity. "Go on," she prodded, gesturing toward the tracks with her pickaxe. "Right," Max said, stepping further into the chamber. "Judging by the minimal wear on these tracks, I'd bet you these carts aren't used much anymore. Perhaps they still lead someplace accessible." Sarah raised both thick red brows. Chapter 6. Sarah wiped her forehead with her arm, leaving behind a trail of sweat. She gripped the pickaxe handle tightly with both hands, lifting it high above her head, before bringing it down with a resounding thud onto the rock wall. As the fragments of the disintegrating rock spiraled to the ground, a sense of accomplishment welled within her. Yet, with every smash against the wall, the pickaxe emitted a hollow metallic bang that echoed eerily through the abandoned mine, making Sarah shudder involuntarily. "How much farther do you think this tunnel goes?" shouted Max through the increasing roar of falling stones around them, his face contorted with a mix of anxiety and apprehension. Sarah grunted with the effort of each swing, her rhythm relentless. "We'll know when and if we break through the other side." Chunks of rock crumbled away during the next few blows, tumbling down to form a pile around Sarah's feet. Her arms throbbed with pain, but Sarah didn't falter. Instead, she powered her way through the excruciating pain in her arms with renewed vigor, driven by a fierce desire to break free and find her way back into the sunlight. The cavernous space grew larger, but progress seemed slow as she took painstaking swings with the pickaxe, careful not to tire herself too quickly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wall began to cave in, releasing a torrent of loose rock and debris that poured into the chamber like a small avalanche. Sarah shielded herself from the cascading rubble, battered and bruised. She glanced at Max with a determined expression. "Let's keep moving," she shouted, brushing away the grit that clung to her hair and clothes. They pressed on further into the tunnel, now somewhat visible thanks to the dim light filtering through the partially collapsed wall. As they advanced, Sarah's foot struck something hard. She shone the flashlight on her feet and saw a small metal box nestled within the dusty stone floor. Chapter 7. Sarah's heavy breathing ricocheted off the jagged gray walls as she pushed harder against the unforgiving stone with her makeshift pickaxe, her heart drumming wildly in her chest. Sweat dripped down her flushed face as she swung, striking the stone with as much force as she could muster. Each echoing clang reverberated through the dim tunnel, her muscles screaming in protest. The pickaxe felt like a lead weight in her trembling hands. She refused to let go. It had become her lifeline. In a last-ditch effort, Sarah summoned every reservoir of strength she had left and delivered a mighty, bone-jarring blow directly to the weakened point. A jagged crack rent the air, and the crumbling wall spit plumes of dust and dusty air. Sunlight sliced through the darkness like an ethereal knife, illuminating her weary form. "Max!" she shouted over the racket of falling debris. "Max, we made it! Look!" A shaft of sunlight bathed Sarah in warm, golden light, penetrating the dark abyss of the abandoned mine. Max appeared from the dwindling glow of their flashlight, his eyes alight with astonishment as he took in the sight before them. Behind Sarah, the walls had crumbled, exposing a narrow passage leading upwards towards the surface. "Come on, we need to get a move on," said Sarah, thrusting her pickaxe aside as she lunged for the passage. The two friends didn't waste a moment. They climbed and clawed their way through the dark, cramped space, leaving behind the echoes of their time in the abandoned mine. Their hearts pounded in their chests as a renewed energy surged within them. With every inch, sunlight spilled into the crevasses behind, illuminating the stark contrast between their former prison and newfound freedom. As they neared the surface, a cool gust of wind caressed their sweaty faces, its crisp freshness eliciting sighs of relief. From somewhere up ahead, Sarah could hear the distant hum of a car engine, amplified by the chasm that shielded them from the outside world. Relieved that they were closing in on freedom, Sarah closed her eyes, mentally replaying the events that transpired within the dreadful depths of the dark mine. Her flashlight flickered off as she emerged from the narrow passage, and Max put a steadying hand on her shoulder as the sun hit her weary frame. "We did it," he breathed, his voice breaking slightly as he realized the gravity of their situation. "We actually made it out." Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She felt a surge of obligation to the countless spirits who had toiled and died in the desolate mine. It was an unshakable conviction that she had fulfilled her purpose and restored peace to the forsaken hearts trapped below the earth. "Thank you, Max," she whispered. The words felt heavy, pulled from the depths of her ribcage. Chapter 8. Max brushed the remaining dirt off his pants, gazing at their surroundings with an expression of unmistakable relief. Sarah, standing next to him, took in the lush forest before them. The sight of emerald leaves fluttering lazily against the backdrop of an azure sky filled her with a sense of near euphoria. But their elation was short-lived. Their journey was far from over, and other daunting trials lay ahead. "You think they'll believe us?" Sarah asked, her voice no more than a whisper. She couldn't help the feeling that they had just barely escaped a vengeful entity, though the cool air and warm sunlight on her skin felt utterly blissful. Max placed his hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out together. But first, let's get out of here." Together they navigated through the dense foliage, attempting to find their campground. Fortunately, Max had paid close attention to the landmarks on their hike. Their footprints indented the damp earth, guiding them back on track to their base camp. They moved through the dense forest, the unfamiliar sounds of crickets and birdsong soothing them. Though it had been a harrowing day, each step brought Sarah closer to safety, and the steady rhythm of their journey was slightly comforting. However, they still hadn't fully recovered from the ordeal. Fatigue clung to them like an unwelcome companion, and the air seemed to weigh heavily on their shoulders. "Did you see that ghost, or whatever it was?" Max asked. His voice was barely audible, similar to Sarah's. "Yeah, I did, but honestly, I'm not sure if it was a figment of my imagination or really there." They picked up their pace, desperate to reach their campsite. The deep, hushed fog that clung to the forest felt foreboding, as though the mine had left an ominous mark upon the land. Finally, after what felt like hours, they stumbled upon the campsite. Relief washed over Sarah and Max as they collapsed upon their sleeping bags. They were back, but the day's events weighed heavily on their minds. Laughter and chatter floated across the campsite from nearby campers, but neither Sarah nor Max felt like socializing. They needed time to process all that had happened, to sort out the lingering mysteries etched into their minds. Awkwardly, they began to recount the ordeal of the haunted mine in a hushed murmur, desperate to find answers to the strange occurrences they encountered underground. Had the ghostly miner been real? Sarah questioned herself, lying on her sleeping bag, staring at the fading stars above. It was a strange coincidence that she'd stumbled upon the ruined mine, and even stranger that Max had appeared just as she started to make progress. The eerie sensations she'd felt and the hands that briefly touched her back as she descended further into the mine added fuel to the possibility of supernatural intervention. But Max's steadfast disbelief in the existence of such things left her questioning if what she'd experienced had been her imagination. Chapter 9. The air within the abandoned mine was cold and clammy, clinging to Sarah's skin like an unwelcome shroud. She shivered, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as she ventured deeper into the darkness. The flashlight in her hand cast a wavering beam of light that danced along the walls, illuminating the jagged rocks that comprised the chamber. "This is it," she murmured, taking in the sight of the cramped space around her. "And this is where it all happened." She shone her flashlight around the area, taking note of the splintered wood and jagged rocks that littered the floor. "The miner died right here, didn't he?" Max looked around nervously. Let's just get out of here, Sarah. We don't need to hang around." But Sarah was already moving deeper into the chamber, her flashlight illuminating a figure in the corner. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miner!" she whispered, unable to believe her eyes. She shone the beam of her flashlight directly on him, the feeble illumination revealing the ghostly figure of the miner. It was only the reflection of her own light that allowed her to see him, the spectral form barely visible to the naked eye. Sarah's cry echoed through the deserted mine, reverberating off the damp walls. Max rushed in after her, his face contorted with concern. "It's not real, Sarah." "It can't be," Max stammered, clutching her arm tightly. But Sarah couldn't tear her gaze away from the spectral figure. The miner's ghost wore the same clothes as the one she had seen in the painting back at the town museum. His eyes seemed to burn with a fierce intensity, as if beckoning her closer. "I don't think we should stick around to find out," Max suggested, his grip on Sarah's arm tightening. "Let's get out of here." Sarah took one final glance at the ghostly apparition, then reluctantly followed Max's lead as they edged their way back through the dark, narrow passageway, retracing their path toward the surface. The miner's ghost remained silent and motionless, as if patiently waiting for them to leave. Exhausted, they finally emerged from the abandoned gold mine, greeted by the warm embrace of golden evening light. Upon reaching the safety of their campsite, they both collapsed onto their sleeping bags, physically and emotionally drained. The sun had begun to fade into the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. Sarah couldn't shake the eerie feeling that lingered in her bones and the unshakable thought that the miner's ghost was still down there, trapped in that pitch-black tomb forever. She shuddered, pulling her sleeping bag tightly around her small frame. "You all right, Sarah?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible. Concern etched deep lines on his young face. Sarah, still trembling, managed to nod in response, her eyes locked on the dancing flame of their campfire. She could still see the ghostly figure of the miner lurking in the damp corners of her mind, his cold gaze seemingly burning through her very soul. I don't know," she stammered, trying to shake off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The two paused in their conversation, the only sounds between them the crackling fire and the distant rustling of leaves in the forest. Chapter 10. A cacophony of scratching sounds echoed through the gloom, sharp and intrusive in the otherwise deathly quiet of the mine. Startled, Sarah froze mid-step, her heart jumping in her chest. She turned slowly, searching the cavernous chamber for the source. All she saw were her own trembling hands holding the flashlight, bathed in the wavering light that cast uncertain shadows dancing upon the damp, dark walls. "Just your imagination, Sarah," Max murmured, close behind her. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, offering a reassuring squeeze. "We both know that. It was likely just the wind whistling through the vents in the ceiling, creating those spooky noises." She leaned into his touch, trying to ignore the way her heart raced in rhythm with her shallow breaths. "I guess you're right." "Well, come on," he said, tightening his grip. "We should get back to exploring before those sounds get any louder." Prodding ahead of her, Max walked among the remains of machinery and tools, long since abandoned. The once bustling room was now silent, save for the crunch of their boots on gravel and the steadfast beat of their hearts. "Remember, Sarah," Max instructed, his voice echoing through the desolate atmosphere. "Keep the flashlights on at all times." Fear gnawed at the back of Sarah's mind, and she hesitated. "Why is that, Max?" He scoffed gently, a hint of humor in his tone. "I thought it was obvious. We can't afford to get lost down here. I have a feeling this place is much bigger than we anticipated. Plus, who knows what kind of creepy things might lurk in the shadows?" Max replied. His voice seemed to bounce and echo throughout the hollow chambers, emphasizing his point. Sarah shivered slightly, though she was glad for the chance to keep her nerves at bay. She turned her gaze back towards the winding tunnels, still unable to shake the discomforting feeling that someone, or something, was watching her from behind. But the sound receded into the distance, and the darkness swallowed it whole. Determined, Sarah pushed onward down the passageway. The air grew chillier, and the ground became uneven, littered with debris and loose stones. She felt the weight of the darkness pressing in on her as she ventured deeper, worrying that the ghostly figures might emerge at any moment. As Sarah moved through the gloomy passage, it began to curve, snake-like, around the walls. Max had requested that they maintain radio contact, ensuring that they were within range of each other. Sarah always had a feeling of delayed caution in situations, so she often preferred to rely on her instincts rather than external rules. This tendency had landed her in trouble before, but she couldn't help feeling felt as though there was an inherent danger lurking in the abandoned mine. As they approached the 10th tube in their search, the eerie sound of scratching overhead echoed through the tunnel. This time, however, the origin of the noise was more distinct. Shadows formed where there should have been none, their shapes dancing along the walls and ceilings with an unsettling fluidity. Chapter 11. Sarah's heavy breaths reverberated through the narrow tunnel, punctuated by the rhythmic dripping of water that echoed off the tunnel walls. Goosebumps prickled her skin as she carefully placed one foot in front of the other, inching closer to her elusive exit. The dark, murky water lapped at her ankles, ice cold and unforgiving. She shuddered as the putrid smell of decay wafted around her, causing her to gag involuntarily. The water was shallow enough that she could wade through it without it rising higher than her knees, but the thought of sinking further into the quagmire was nauseating. As she trudged through the smelly sludge, the sound of her splashing footsteps grew louder, amplifying the echoes in the narrow, flooded passage. Sarah strained towards the dim, flickering light bouncing off the walls from her flashlight, rendering the damp, uneven tunnel seem even darker than before. The gap widened and narrowed a few times, as if nature wanted to toy with her sanity before allowing her a glimmer of hope. As she inched forward, Sarah noticed something catching her eye. A large mineral deposit glowing eerily beneath the dripping water. Her mind whirred with possibilities, dark figures lurking in their shadows, and strange mineral deposits lighting up the gloom. "Max, come look!" Sarah exclaimed. "You've got to see this." Max carefully made his way through the water, doing his best to avoid the slimy residue that clung to the surface. In the darkness of the tunnel, it was near impossible to gauge his distance or depth, but his single-minded determination to stay close to Sarah propelled him forward until finally he made it to her side. "Oh, what do you got there, Sarah?" Max had to raise his voice a few octaves just to be heard over the dripping cacophony. "What have you found? I can hardly see anything." Sarah pointed the beam of her flashlight at the strange rock formation, illuminating an alien landscape within their dark and dank surroundings. The peculiar mineral deposit jutted out from the wall, emitting a soft, ethereal glow against the damp walls of the tunnel. Its uneven surface was dotted with flecks of rust red and sapphire blue, catching fleeting glimmers of light in the otherwise dismal space. Max whistled. Now that's something you don't see every day. Quite extraordinary, Max murmured, unable to tear his gaze away from the mysterious deposit. A sense of wonder mingled with unease within him. The peculiar brightness that emanated from such a mundane source inspired awe, yet the enigmatic allure of the deposit fueled his trepidation, as if the gleaming stones whispered promises of hidden secrets and buried stories. As if sensing their curiosity, the iridescent glows seemed to pulse with greater intensity, casting ethereal shadows on the rough tunnel walls. Sarah felt ice-cold fingers of fear creep up her spine. Chapter 12. For days, Sarah wandered the catacombs beneath the earth, her heart echoing the labyrinthine caverns of the lonely mine. Once, she hummed a melodic tune to banish the vacuous emptiness of the mine, but now, her breaths came in shallow heaves, her fingers brushing against the cold, damp walls as if seeking out a lifeline. The chasms swallowed her pleas for help, and the labyrinth mocked her fervor with its echoes, winding and vanishing into the darkness. "Max!" Sarah whimpered, her voice becoming more desperate with every passing second. As if responding to her desperation, Max's voice ringed back through the gloomy cavern. "Sarah, keep going. I'm getting closer." With renewed determination fueling her every step, Sarah pressed onward, clinging to the glimmer of hope Max's voice ignited within her. Just as the darkness seemed to be snuffing her out, Max's flashlight flickered into view. His features were etched with exhaustion, his eyes hollow, yet his face was a welcoming beacon in the abyss. "Come on, Sarah," he said hoarsely, holding out a shaky hand for her to grasp. They carefully retraced their steps back through the winding passageway, the occasional drop of water echoing like gunfire around them. Time blurred as they moved toward the faintest hints of light that represented their salvation. The icy water soon became shallow enough that Sarah and Max no longer needed to wade. Finally, the cold, clammy walls of the mining tunnel receded, revealing a small chamber, its ceiling higher than what they'd endured so far. Sarah felt her strength surge back as sunlight pierced through the dingy darkness, brightening the room and chasing away the ghostly memories. Her eyes scanned the area around them. Tree roots had begun to permeate the space as if in an effort to reclaim it for nature. Sarah and Max exchanged weary but relieved smiles and leaned heavily against it, a look of intense gratitude crossing his face. Sarah and Max exchanged weary but relieved smiles. Max cursed Sarah and Max, explaining to her that she shouldn't care. Care. Was she capable of caring more? Was she capable of caring more? "Max," explained Hurry. "We made it," he murmured, sounding as surprised as Sarah felt. Sarah allowed her body to relax for the first time in what felt like hours. Leaning her head back against the cool stone wall, the cool wind caressed her face like a feather. She took a deep breath and savored the feeling of clean air entering her lungs. It never felt so liberating to breathe in, as if the suffocating darkness of the mind had left an invisible film behind. As they prepared to navigate through the dense foliage that separated the mine's entrance from the rest of the forest, Sarah took one last glance at the sinister cave. It seemed different now, in the daylight, just a relic of a time long past, rather than her personal, terrifying maze. She felt a strange reluctance pull at her heart, whispering to her to keep silent about this harrowing ordeal. Something told her that no one would believe them, but Sarah pushed down that feeling, knowing better than to ignore the warning that she couldn't quite put into words. She turned and followed Max towards the thick line of trees, shielding her face from branches and leaves. The forest floor crunched underfoot as the two of them made their way back to camp. Sarah's thoughts were still muddled with the day's events. She couldn't help but wonder if they had imagined the entire grueling experience. Surely it wasn't possible that they'd encountered supernatural forces deep within the bowels of the old gold mine. Max broke the silence first. Do you think there are more hidden mines in these woods or underground? Sarah shivered at the thought. Considering what we just went through, I hope not. They trudged in silence until the familiar sight of their campsite greeted them. Chapter 13. Sarah stretched her aching muscles as she perched on a rocky ridge, gazing out at the dreary landscape that sprawled before her. Her breath fogged in the cold air, a fleeting reminder of her own life force amidst the void that surrounded her. The damp, earthy stench clung to her winter coat, its hairs damp and matted with perspiration, the remnants of hours spent navigating the sinister labyrinth. Sarah stood atop a jagged incline, her gaze sweeping over the foreboding landscape. Craggy cliffs loomed in the distance, their menacing silhouettes casting lengthening shadows over the vale. Her heart skipped a beat as she tried to quell the creeping dread that whispered to her from the gloom below. Max appeared beside her, dropping his backpack with a heavy thud. He breathed heavily, but warily eyed the empty path that snaked past the desolate mine. Look, we've got to get back to camp before it gets darker, it said firmly. We can explore more tomorrow. Sarah cast one last glance at the gaping maw of the abandoned mine, hesitation etching lines into her face. Fine, she agreed, her voice trailing off as she reluctantly shifted her focus to the hiking trail before them. We're coming back tomorrow. Max nodded, slinging his pack over his shoulders, and together they descended the ridge and entered the densely wooded area. Their pace was deliberate yet cautious, the eeriness of the mine still clinging to them like a damp, unwanted blanket. As they walked, small clusters of bright orange mushrooms poked out from rotting tree trunks, casting an otherworldly glow upon the surrounding foliage. For Sarah, the sight reminded her of the eerie glow emitted by that strange mineral deposit deep within the mine. She wondered if the mine and the forest were somehow connected. Perhaps there was a vast network of subterranean tunnels below the forests that they could one day explore. On a damp, moss-covered fallen log, Max sank gratefully, stretching his legs out and exhaling a deep sigh. Sarah joined him, her tired eyes examining the rich labyrinth of trees and vines that surrounded them. Every breath seemed to rejuvenate her body, and she knew their adventure in the mine had brought them closer, not just as partners, but as friends. Every so often, a light breeze would snake through the dense foliage, eliciting a gentle rustling of leaves together, painting intriguing stories of survival and resilience. The sun seeped through the arboreal canopy, casting a warm and soothing embrace around them. Sarah smiled as the tendrils of sunlight grazed her shoulders, offering her a gentle reminder that even amid the gloom and desolation, there were always fragments of beauty to unearth. Her gaze flitted across the landscape, taking in the richness and splendor that nature had enshrouded in mystery. The vibrant array of colors in the foliage, the rich, loamy scent of earth, and the melody of birdsong serenading them from the treetops. A shiver of excitement ran down her spine at the thought of what secrets might lurk beneath the surface. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The trees swayed gently above, their leaves rustling in the cool breeze. Max and Sarah exchanged a knowing glance, both silent in their anticipation of what lay ahead. Max led the way as they navigated the dense thicket, stepping carefully over fallen branches and tumbling rocks. The air grew cooler the deeper they ventured, and a chill settled in Sarah's bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, hoping to ward off the creeping cold. Sarah's thoughts kept drifting back to the ghostly figures she had encountered during her previous trek. She couldn't help but wonder if she would come face to face with more spectral beings in these dark recesses. Max broke through the underbrush and called back to her, "Come on, Sarah, we're almost there." Steeling herself, Sarah plowed through the vegetation, determined to push through the discomfort. Max turned around and smiled warmly at her, holding out his hand to help her over a fallen log. "We're almost there," he assured her, his voice steady and composed. Sarah managed to summon a grateful half-smile in response, appreciating the familiar safety net of his unshakable confidence. Together they clambered up a steep incline, gripping tree roots for support. Finally, they reached a small wooden platform built among the tree branches, affording them a partially obstructed view of their campsite nestled deep in the forest. Chapter 14. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled out of the mine, every muscle in her body screaming in protest against the exertion. The endless expanse of rusted machinery and overgrown weeds stretched out before her, glistening in the feeble sunlight that filtered through the gray clouds above. Her heart pounded fiercely in her chest, reverberating through her body like a deafening drumbeat. She staggered forward, her legs wobbling beneath her, scorching pain shooting through her calves from the unforgiving terrain. Slowly, she pushed herself upright, her fingers splayed against the cool metal entrance to the mine, her chest heaving in great trembling gasps. A suffocating silence hung in the air, stifling her attempts at speech. Max emerged from the gloom several seconds later, his face etched with concern and relief. "Sarah, God, are you okay?" he asked urgently, rushing to her side. Sarah shrugged weakly, ignoring the nausea that churned in her stomach. "Yeah, just exhausted." She forced a smile, unwilling to tarnish the moment with her own emotional burden. "We did it, Max." He returned the smile, patting her on the back. "Yeah, we did it, but now we need to get you out of here and into a hot shower, stat." He began to help Sarah hobble away from the mine, casting wary glances around them as they made their way across the desolate landscape. The ever-present hum of distant machinery filled her ears, a constant reminder of the hidden operations taking place beneath their feet. Sarah's gaze lingered on the entrance to the abandoned gold mine, the gaping maw of grime and debris threatening to swallow her whole. Her breath was a ragged whisper as she tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but each painful step forward sent daggers of protest through her aching calves. "If there's anything I've learned about you," Max began, his voice gentle and encouraging, "it's that you possess an iron will. You persevere, even when the odds are stacked against you." Sarah, her body still trembling from the intense ordeal of the mine rescue, managed a weak smile in reply. "Thanks, Max. I needed that." The pair stood quietly for several moments, both contemplating the daunting journey they had just endured, yet also appreciating the camaraderie that had been forged between them during the experience. "Look, listen, Sarah." Max's voice broke the silence, his hands gripping hers tightly. "I know we didn't exactly get off on the right foot back at the bar, but I just want you to know that I respect you. A lot." Sarah squinted up at him, her expression guarded for a moment. "Is that so?" He nodded earnestly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I mean it. What you just did back there in that mine, it was incredible. You didn't let the fear or exhaustion get the best of you. I admire that." He paused, casting a glance at the ominous mine entrance beside them before his gaze returned to Sarah. "So I hope we can put our previous misunderstandings behind us. You could use a real friend right now, don't you agree?" Max's voice softened as he awaited her response. Chapter 15. Sarah's trembling eased as the last vestiges of physical exhaustion dissipated, replaced instead by a profound sense of accomplishment. The chilling silence that had weighed down upon her earlier lifted, and she suddenly found herself able to take in her surroundings. Max stood beside her, a steady and reassuring presence that Sarah could feel almost like a physical force. Thoughts of her experience still swirled in her mind, and Sarah struggled to comprehend the reality of it. She had never been in such a dire situation before. Being trapped in the abandoned gold mine had tested her limits and left an indelible impression on her young mind. Yet, she emerged victorious, stronger than before. Sarah knew she had pushed herself to her breaking point, struggling against the maze-like depths of the mine, the eerie darkness that harbored ghostly shadows, and the terrifying sounds that echoed through chilling caverns. But as she took in the barren and desolate wasteland that appeared before her now, she felt a strange sense of gratitude. Through the ordeal, she had discovered an inner fortitude and a new appreciation for life. Max had been by her side throughout it all, His unwavering support and confidence in her abilities had helped to push back the tide of despair and fear that threatened to consume her during their time inside the labyrinthine tunnels. "Are you okay, Sarah?" Max asked, concern tinging his voice. "I am, Max. More than okay," she responded, with a firm nod. "This journey taught me more than I ever expected it to. I learned a lot about myself, about mining, and about perseverance," Sarah said thoughtfully, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as the wind danced through her red curls. "Like I said, you're a fighter, Sarah. I couldn't be more proud of you. You prove that anything is possible when you put your mind to it," Max replied, his hand finding hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I think my determination helped me get through some of the darkest moments," Sarah admitted, reflecting on the harrowing experience. "But I also can't emphasize how crucial Max's presence was to my survival. He never faltered, never lost hope." The two friends walked slowly towards the campsite, allowing their hearts to slow down and catch up with their bodies. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the ruined landscape. As they reached the periphery of the camp, Max's gaze darted towards the towering mountains that loomed in the distance. "Have you ever climbed those?" he asked, gesturing at the peaks. Sarah shook her head, amazed by the sheer audacity of the question. "No, not ever. Why, do you think I should give it a shot?" "Well, it looks like an incredible challenge. Maybe it could be our next adventure," Max suggested with a twinkle in his eye. Sarah laughed. If you like this story, and for more dark stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. See ya!